including 6 of the 8 films in the first Astrid Nielsen series, the first 2 in the second series, and 1 standalone film. So in all, 23 of 27 Astrid Nielsen films premiered in Australia before the war. And so this is just a kind of a case study of that, what that looks like. Okay, so here's Astrid Nielsen in When the Mask Falls. Each of these films, these 9 and now 10 with this film, had premiered at one of West's luxurious cinema palaces in both Australia, either the Olympia and Glaciarium in Sydney. The Glaciarium was an ice rink 9 months of the year and a cinema the rest of it. The Palace in Melbourne, the Princess in Sydney, West Pictures in Adelaide, or the Olympia in Brisbane. And New Zealand, such as King's Theatre in Wellington, where When the Mask Falls opened on January 13th, 1913. And all of these films then, preceding this film, had gone on to circulate through several more of West's cinemas, urban cinemas, for a few months before being hired out to suburban and rural exhibitors that kept the films in circulation for up to several more years. So when the Mask Falls opened in Sydney, it became the 11th Astrid Nielsen picture in circulation in Australasia at that moment. So all the preceding films were still in circulation when this one came in. So including the 9 earlier imports by West's and 1 imported by the Clement Mason Cinematograph Company. I try to imagine having like 11 Mads Mikkelsen films in circulation at the same time. It blows the mind. So this much is clear, but one of the challenges, as you all know, in working with early cinema history is the lack of documentation, both about the films themselves and their movement through the world. None of the information I just gave you about the circulation of Nielsen's films is available in either private or state archives in Germany, which contain no company records for either Deutsche Bioskop or Pagu, as far as I can tell. If you found any, let me know. Or from British or Australasian archives, where no records of West's pictures appear to have been preserved. None of the logbooks of West cinemas have survived, as far as anyone can tell me, and government import and censorship records were not kept systematically until after the passage of the Cinematograph Film Censorship Acts of 16 in New Zealand and 17 in Australia. So who knew to be grateful to the censors, but it's really actually nice to go back and see which films were imported. At least they wrote them down. So the only place where were discernible traces of the ephemeral passage of Nielsen's films through Australasian cinemas, confirming what Gregory Waller calls instantiation, can consistently found in the pages of various local and regional newspapers, as Frederica has already shown. Although this information has been readily available in this print media for more than a century, for anyone who wanted to go dig through all the microfilms and spend their whole life doing that, it wasn't until they became available in accessible in a searchable format to researchers outside the region in 2007, when the National Library of New Zealand updated its online New Zealand newspaper database, Papers Past, to be OCR searchable, followed in 2008 by the Australian National Library's digital database Trove, both of which are free and give users access anywhere in the world to the pages of more than 700 digitized newspapers. More newspapers are being added on a regular basis, so the results cited in this paper, in this issue, in my book, are all likely to be changed, but this is a minimum. Like there's at least this many references to Astrid Nielsen, to her films. Through these digital archives, the tremendous popularity of Nielsen's pre-war films in Australia and New Zealand can be documented, mapped, and fleshed out with contextual details that not only reveal how far her films circulated, but also suggest what they might have meant to the people who watched them. And so that's a little bit what I get to into the book. I meant to write, this book was meant to be about Astrid Nielsen in Australia, but it ended up having to have a lot more context to make sense of what it meant to have all these films there. But today's paper, I want to talk just about trying to find Astrid Nielsen. And the first step in using Trove and Papers Past is determining the parameters of your search and the most effective search terms. Stephen Bottomore has pointed out that simply searching for Nielsen's name is a good place to start, but it's inadequate on its own, in part because the spelling challenge it posed to typesetters at the time. In a mid-2021 search of her name as spelled properly, you get about 1,400 results. But if you add all the other ones in, you get more than 2,000 references between 1911 and 1915, with 27 film titles, some of them being changed, and many variant spellings. So Asa, Istra, Astra, Aster, Esther, Nielsen, Nilsson, Nelson. It goes on. It's crazy. So you have to keep trying all the combinations to find out whether Istra Nelson is also Esther Nilsson, is also Asta. And so this means that this 2,000 references is likely lower than the actual total, since the poor resolution of many newspapers means that a lot of references don't get recognized. And the fragmentary nature of the collections guarantees that some are missing. But on the other hand, it's also inflated because some films are erroneously attributed to Nielsen and others are listed by multiple titles. And so you get the same film being called many things. I'll talk about that tomorrow with Quo Vadis. But in Asta's case, when you search by these various combinations of her name, it's a good place to start. But then searching by film title in conjunction with her name is very necessary, since the films often have very common names. Her filmography is very well established, but the challenge is determining which English titles her German and Danish produced films ran under in the Australasian market. Nielsen's first two films for Deutsche Bioskop, for example, are Heißes Blut and Nachtfalter, which were released in Australia as Hypnotized and Retribution, rather than Burning Blood and Moths, as they were known in other English-speaking markets. So you have to know to look for Hypnotized instead of Burning Blood and Retribution instead of Moths. And of these two, only the latter appears to have been released in New Zealand under the title Retribution. In some cases, the same film ran under different names on both sides of the Tasman Sea. For example, the 1913 film S1, the second film in the third Asta Nielsen series, was released in Australia in May 1914 as A Girl's Sacrifice, and in New Zealand 2 months later as A Woman of the People. So, confusing enough? So once we've established some of the titles of her films and the spellings of her name, we can begin to track the movements of the films. Newspaper listings in Trove and Papers Past confirm that, as I mentioned before, 23 of the 27 Asta Nielsen films produced between 1911 and 14 were released in Australia, and 19 of them in New Zealand in the pre-World War I period. While a few of the films ran for an unusually short period, Hypnotized, I can only find one reference for 3 days, or unusually long, When the Mask Falls appears to have been running sporadically for 5.5 years. Most Asta Nielsen films seem to have opened in Australia within 3 to 6 months of their German release, after which they circulated for between 18 and 24 months. The pattern seems to be they open at a West Cinema Palace in a major urban area and run for a week, and then move on to 2 or 3 West cinemas in other metropolitan areas, and then move on to the suburban circuit of suburban and rural cinemas in the various states. They often ran alongside other European and American films, but were generally highlighted as the star picture, while Nielsen herself was celebrated by name for her fame and acting skills. And that's a whole separate story about how well-known she was by name, even if they misspelled it a lot. And so we'll look at this pattern in the case of When the Mask Falls, which is considered mostly lost, and is therefore largely inaccessible as an object of study on its own, but which has left really clear traces in these digitized papers. Trove allows users to sort hits by date, by decade, year, and month, so you can narrow it down to when you want, while Papers Past allows you to specify a date range. A Trove search for When the Mask Falls returns 248 results in newspapers, gazettes, and magazines. If you limit the results by date, that produces 234 references within the decade 1910 to 1919, when the film would most likely have been in circulation. The earliest relevant listings for When the Mask Falls appeared in Sydney newspapers in December 1912, announcing the imminent screenings of the film as the star picture at West's 2 Sydney Pictures theaters, the Glaciarium, the Ice Rink, and the Olympia. In these ads preceding its Australasian premiere, the film was advertised only with the name of its lead performer, the quote, fascinating Danish actress, Asta Nielsen, but no further elaboration about the film's origins or Nielsen's credentials. And in fact, one of the reasons I ended up writing this book is because I was so confused by the fact that they never, ever mentioned the German origins of any of Asta Nielsen's films, and in fact, often attribute her films to Nordisk and to Pathé, and she's associated with French theaters, and she intersects with a lot of other discourses. In Papers Past, a search of the same parameters produces 148 hits in New Zealand that start with a notification in the Wellington Evening Post on January 9th, 1913, that When the Mask Falls, featuring, quote, Miss Asta Nielsen, would be opening the following Monday at the King's Theatre. It replaced the drama The Child Stealers, possibly Imp's The Child Stealers of Paris, which had run head-to-head against Zara Bernard's Queen Bess, well, they call it Queen Bess in Australia, the Loves of Queen Elizabeth, at His Majesty's Theatre, also operated by West's rivals, John Fuller and Sons. Trove and Papers Past also allow users to sort their results geographically, which provides a sense of where a film was shown, for how long, and how many, and you can sort of guess at how many prints were in circulation, as well as mapping circulation routes. For example, at least 4 prints of Den Zwarte Droom, which ran in Australia and New Zealand as The Circus Girl, not The Black Dream, which was the first Asta Nielsen import by West, had to be in circulation, at least 4 prints had to be in circulation in September 1911, given simultaneous screenings in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Perth. But it seems to have been more usual to import 2 or 3 prints of each film. In the case of When the Mask Falls in Australia, the film is mentioned most frequently in Queensland, 60 times, New South Wales, 56, followed by Western Australia, 39, and South Australia, 38, Victoria, 25, and Tasmania, 14. The listings in Queensland span a 4-month period from an initial screening at West Pictures in Brisbane on February 22nd, 1913, to a final screening at Martu's Olympia in Ipswich on May 10th the same year. By contrast, all 14 mentions in Tasmania occur within a single week, from 30th of September through 7th of October 1913, when the film was screened by the English Amusement Company in Launceston and Hobart. Advertised as part of the Aston Nielsen boom, a tagline first used by West in Sydney 9 months earlier, when the screening of When the Mask Falls in the Grand Empire Theatre in Hobart was originally scheduled to compete with the monumental Chinas drama Quo Vadis, and then it was inadvertently delayed due to an unspecified mishap, which I think was they didn't want to run head-to-head with Quo Vadis, and so they pushed it back till Monday when Quo Vadis had left. So from these listings, we can determine that at least 2 prints, there's another still from the film for you, were in Sydney during the film's 2-week run at West Olympia in December and January, where it was screened approximately 34 times in total, nightly showings at 8 p.m. in 2 theaters with matinees at 2:30 p.m. on Wednesdays and Saturdays, but no screenings on Sundays. Sometimes they would do free screenings where you could give like a coin for the church. It was kind of trying to get around, you shouldn't go to cinema on Sunday, but people wanted to go to the cinema on Sunday. And West was a good Christian. His partner, Henry Hayward in New Zealand, had no such constraints. So these 2 prints seem to have been sent to different parts of the country after this, where they moved independently of each other. They used similar advertising strategies, which suggest some coordination between the distributor and the exhibitors. So I think West owned the rights and leased them out. So it went from Sydney to Newcastle, the coal mining town, screened for 3 nights at the Star Cinema, together with the Vitagraph drama The Raja's Hatred, and one more night at the Imperial Pictures, also in Newcastle, accompanied by the Western The Reformation of Sierra Smith, the Vitagraph comedy The Godmother, and the Pate comedy The Waterfunker, Max Aperlo, with Max Lander. 2 weeks later, the films were on opposite sides of Australia, with one playing for 2 weeks at the Stadium and Palace Gardens theatres in the gold mining towns of Kalgoorlie and Boulder, Western Australia, and the other at West Olympia and Princess Theatres in Brisbane, Queensland. And these are huge distances we're talking about. And so the railways, as were mentioned earlier, become a major circuit for trying to figure out how these films moved where they did. So I have a custom map at the beginning of the book that shows the railway lines and shows the towns kind of clustered around them and how the films moved. But sometimes the newspaper listings are not clear and they create more questions than they answer. For one example, from Kalgoorlie Boulder, one print of When the Mask Falls appears to have traveled nearly 500 kilometers west to the Palace Theatre in North and Western Australia, where it opened on Friday, March 7th, while the other moved on to the Empire Theatre in Toowoomba, Queensland, where it opened on March 8th. But the film was also advertised as playing in Midland Junction, Western Australia, on the outskirts of Perth, 77 kilometers west of Northam, on the same evening, which would have required a third print or a very speedy mode of transportation to move the film between Northam and Midland. I mean, there are people who like bicycle sort of, Cinema Paradiso style between small towns with reels of the film, but I don't think 77 kilometers is realistic for that. In the absence of company records, it's impossible to know whether West simply ordered more prints after a few months, or if other factors were involved, such as a mistake in the scheduling, or sometimes a print has gotten destroyed. But it seems clear that at least 3, possibly 4 prints were in circulation in Australia from March through June 1913, with one each circulating in Queensland, Western Australia, and Victoria. And you'll often see that one print will stay in a particular state for years and years. And I guess that one didn't get as damaged, or somebody just hung on to it and shows it for a revival screening on New Year's 3 years later. So we can't figure out which print goes where, but we can tell that how many prints there are and what happens with them. And so lots more information I'm not going to read to you about which film goes to which town when, but we do find out that it continues to circulate until 1918. And so it also seems clear that there's a separate print sent to New Zealand because of the concurrent screenings. It would have been practical to send it back and forth between them. The last screening in Sydney was on January 10th, and the first screening in Wellington on January 13th. And the film remained in circulation in New Zealand until January 1914. But the way the film moved in New Zealand, sequentially from 1 week in Wellington, followed by 3 days in Auckland, 3 days in Christchurch 2 weeks later, then 10 days later, 3 days in Palmerston North, 3 days in Wanganui, 3 in New Plymouth, and so on, strongly suggests only a single print was circulating in New Zealand. The frequency of 3-day seasons reflects this common practice of changing the entire program once midweek, while the gaps between screening account for travel time between locations on the different islands. The route taken by the film is not particularly intuitive. Think Wellington, Auckland, Christchurch, New Plymouth. but that represents the haphazard nature of distribution, and a large percentage of the screenings take place at Hayward's theaters, which were affiliated with West's, so it seems to be they were keeping the film in their own exclusive circuits. Another area where there's not a lot of clarity and the newspapers actually complicate things is regard to the supply chain. West bought the rights, but who did he buy them from? And a lot of the reviews of the film The Kalgoorlie Miner describe it as a Walterdam masterpiece, which suggests that West might have obtained it, his exclusive rights and prints from that British film renting company, whose managing directors, along with those of the hiring agents A.E. Hoopsch, were major investors in West's exhibition company, West's Picture Playhouses. In an ad for a screening in Lower Hutt, New Zealand in July 1913, the film was attributed to Hoopsch. But contrastingly, reviews of the film in various towns in Western Australia describe it as an exclusive sourced from West's erstwhile rival Spencer's Pictures. But by then, Spencer's and West's had combined into the Combine, and so that might have been a reason people conflated those two, or it might have been an error, or it might have been contravention of West's claims. In any case, the producers never mentioned these ads, but the Kalgoorlie Miner in Kalgoorlie, Western Australia, credits the film to Deutsch Film, which is unusual awareness of German origins, one of the very, very few references, but it doesn't include the bioscope part of the name. And in Ballarat, in Wales, various locations in New Zealand, it's advertised as a Nordisk Star Picture, which, as I mentioned, is very, very common here. And so my basic takeaway is that this access to these previously unavailable circulation data that Trove and Papers Past gives us is remarkable. It allows us to really rewrite the history of cinema in Australia and New Zealand, which makes no mention of Nielsen in any way, no mention of her tremendous popularity, or in fact of the tremendous popularity of European cinema in general. That's why I had to write my book. We can see that following the success of this 11th film, a dozen more Asta Nielsen films are released in the next 2 years, and we can track them all through the region and see just how much name recognition she had, how popular she was, which makes the mystery of why none of her post-war films were released in Australia or New Zealand all the more confusing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julie. And now it is Martin Leuperdinger's and my turn to present the importing Asta Nielsen database as a tool for digital research and the global circulation on local exhibition of Asta Nielsen's long feature series before the First World War. And I quickly introduce Martin Leuperdinger. He's a professor emeritus of media studies at the University of Trier, and he is co-director of the Asta Nielsen project. And he has published widely on early cinema, and he has curated the international conference Importing Asta Nielsen. And he's also the initiator of the Importing Asta Nielsen database. And I hope he's here. Yes, so he's here. Zugeschaltet. My name is Yvonne Zimmerman. I'm a professor of media studies at Philipps University Marburg, and I'm the co-author of Advertising and the Transformation of Screen Cultures, a book that has been published a few months ago at Amsterdam University Press. And I'm also co-directing the Asta Nielsen project together with Martin, and I'm the editor of this special issue on Asta Nielsen in early popular visual culture. So to the Importing Asta Nielsen database. The early 1910s are the transitional period from short film programs to the long feature film. The many thousands of daily newspapers worldwide can be used as a vast and rich archive of information to research the emergence and presentation of early film stars. In recent years, digital newspaper archives such as Anno from Austria, Hungarica from Hungary, the British newspaper archive, Trove and Papers Past that we just had examples of, and Gallica from France provide more and more readily accessible resources to study local cinema histories and also to do comparative research on film distribution and exhibition. Cinema advertisements in daily newspapers worked somehow as the interface between local cinema managers and their audiences, which retrieved useful information by reading the promotion of film programs and films. Today, these local cinema ads are a treasure trove of rich but still relatively unexplored information on promotion, exhibition, and reception of films and film stars that allow us to ask and answer new historiographical questions on the cinema. Worldwide cinema business, as it was common in the 1910s, combined the global distribution of film prints with local screenings of moving pictures. Film screenings that gave access to world-famous film stars were framed by the local circumstances of venue, censorship, advertising, as well as class, age, and gender of the local audiences. For example, the local press can add to a more and nuanced understanding of the emergence of the film star system and its national and local specificities against the backdrop of the introduction of the long feature film as a decidedly international phenomenon. And this is where Asta Nielsen and the Importing Asta Nielsen database come into play. The Importing Asta Nielsen database has been a work in progress since 2013, and as far as we know, is the only database of printed advertisements that promoted an international film star of the 1910s. The 7th edition of the database, which will be launched in a few minutes, includes more than 16,000 cinema advertisements, promotional texts, and articles from local newspapers and trade papers of more than 20 countries related to the distribution and exhibition of all the 27 long feature films starring Asta Nielsen released before the First World War. The Importing Asta Nielsen database is a digital tool to explore local film cultures across various countries and to trace and map the national as well as the international circulation of those 27 Asta Nielsen films. The database also enables transnational comparisons of Asta Nielsen's diva and star profiles, of film programming, of exhibition modes, and of cinema advertising practices. In addition, the Importing Asta Nielsen database provides the empirical basis for an analysis of the cross-border compilation variants of Asta Nielsen's long feature series, also of the running times of her films, and of local exhibition contexts in terms of programming, live performances, audience responses, and censorship. In this way, the Importing Asta Nielsen database contributes an empirical basis to help respond to the recent call for comparison in new cinema history. The database includes some 2,000 ads extracted from the trade press of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Great Britain, Russia, France, and the United States. Yet the bulk of the database consists of a large collection of local cinema ads. The database includes 4,800 ads from Germany, more than 3,000 from Austria-Hungary, some 2,500 from Australia, 2,000 from New Zealand, and some 900 from Great Britain. In addition, a few cities from other countries show up: Barcelona, Rio de Janeiro, Singapore, Jakarta, Lodz, Copenhagen, and Reykjavik, for example. Each local advertisement as represented in the database is enriched with metadata indicating publication date, publisher, town, film title, and persons mentioned in the ads. These metadata provide many options for relational context research, which Martin will now illustrate.
So, hello everybody, I follow with the second part of our paper. First, on the local level, many cinema managers followed sophisticated rules in promoting their film programs. Ads for Asta Nielsen films show a wide variety in their size, design, content, and functions. They could be published in advance of a film's run, at a film's opening, during the run, and as a final reminder before it closed. Local cinema ads for Asta Nielsen films show an enormous variety of graphic design. A special case is Australia, where some newspapers limited graphic design to the repetition of characters. Thus, Austrian cinema chains created visually impressive aids by compiling columns and words in different sizes for the names of early film stars or film titles. The design of cinema ads provides visual indication about the rank and status of early film stars. The relative sizes of the star's name, the company's name, and the film title reveal quite clearly whether the film star, the production company, or the promoted film was considered the main attraction of the program. As Friederike Grimm has shown in her article in Early Popular Visual Culture, some cinema managers followed the distributor's advice and used portrait vignettes of Asta Nielsen to promote her star persona. Some cinema managers were reluctant to do so and consequently hid the star beneath much larger characters of the film's title. While many ads label Nielsen the doer of cinema art or the Danish Bernard, others focus on the great sensation of the film. Information on live performance during film screenings is given by naming musicians, conductors, composers, or lecturers. Musical scores and orchestras accompanying Asta Nielsen films were much appreciated in Vienna. More remarkably, local orchestra conductors and conductresses are often mentioned in Australasian cinema ads. Metadata of persons mentioned in ads for Asta Nielsen films open a wide field of context and relations. For instance, ads that combine Asta Nielsen and the German Emperor William II, or ads that name Asta Nielsen the Danish Bernard, or the first ads that feature Asta Nielsen together with other film stars such as Suzanne Grandet, or ads that name Asta Nielsen the Danish Bernard or the doer of cinema, thus equating her with the most famous theater divas of the time. The name of Sarah Bernard is very small beneath the name of Asta Nielsen in this ad of IMP, Lemle's company. So these search options for persons refer to Asta Nielsen's status as an international film star and diva in context and hence on global aspects of her stardom. On the national level, the Importing Asta Nielsen database can help to answer some basic questions in regard to the 3 Asta Nielsen series that were crucial both for Nielsen's career and for the emergent star system. The business model of the series combined the international marketing of the film star as a brand with exclusive blind and block booking. But how many cinema managers in a given country really did book in advance such series of 7 or 8 long feature films at that time? This question refers to a national level of research. To answer such questions on film business practice, it is necessary to at least cover the local press of more than half of the big cities of a country. We had to do this in the case of Germany on the basis of microfilmed newspapers. From our sample of more than 4,800 local cinema ads, we can say that the business model of blind and block booking, the 3 Asta Nielsen series, worked quite well in Germany. In our sample of 50 German cities and towns, we found that in around 30 cities, cinemas did indeed block book the Asta Nielsen series. Friederike will publish her respective findings in her dissertation next year. In the case of Austria-Hungary, the empirical database is not as strong. The website Austrian Newspapers Online privileges newspapers in German language, and therefore big cities in Hungary and also in Galicia are not covered yet, and only a few are covered on Hungarian and on Croatian websites. From our more than 3,000 Austro-Hungarian cinema ads, 1/2 comes from cinemas in Vienna. It seems that the 2 million inhabitants of Vienna, as well as audiences in Prague, Bratislava, Lviv, Czernowitz, and Budapest, were first in getting access to new Asta Nielsen films, while other cities followed with a considerable time lag. The ads suggest block booking in 15 to 20 of the 33 cities we researched. Federici will discuss these questions in her dissertation too. In the case of Great Britain, only around 900 local cinema ads could be found on the website British Newspapers Online of the British Library. It seems that British cinema managers did less rely on local newspaper advertising than their colleagues in Germany and Austria. Therefore, the British local press lacks regular and reliable information on first and second runs of Asta Nielsen films. Here, the main source of information is the film renting company Walter and their promotion of the Asta Nielsen exclusive series in the trade press. Australia, and New Zealand can be called the paradise for scholars who do local cinema history research. Most of the local newspapers are accessible online, and it seems that local newspapers were the privileged means of information and promotion. As Julie Allen has just shown for the feature film When the Mask Falls, even the travel route of single film prints can be mapped in Australia and New Zealand, at least in parts. Thank you. And for the outlook of the paper, I now pass to Yvonne.
So we end this paper with an outlook on possible futures now that our research project on Asta Nielsen has come to an end. The importing Asta Nielsen database presents a large aggregated data set that we have collected, enriched with metadata, and studied so far with the help of the research functions provided by the database and with the method of close reading mainly. Among the next steps that we wish to take is to tinker with the database with the help of digital tools, that is to test distant reading approaches, for examples, or network analysis, and to experiment with visualization tools. We intend to do this in the context of the Digital Cinema Hub project that we conduct at Marburg University in cooperation with the universities of Mainz and Frankfurt. It is a project that combines established hermeneutic methods of film studies with the new digital research tools and methods in order to implement them in research, but mainly also in teaching within the discipline of film studies. And thereby, one challenge will be the fact that the ads in the importing Asta Nielsen database do not have OCR, which is mainly due to the original graphic and visual design of many ads that standard OCR software cannot recognize. So if you remember the ad from Australia, so this is a problem for OCR so far. But we are currently working on enriching the data by coding them as norm data and by linking them as linked open data. And the importing Asta Nielsen database is an open and collaborative project. We welcome contributions from scholars and students to the database, be they further articles and ads on Asta Nielsen to be included in the database, or also ideas and advice on how to further develop and link the database with existing resources on the history of film promotion, distribution, exhibition, and reception. Thank you for your attention. So, and we immediately continue with our respondent, Ian Christie, he's one of those scholars who definitely don't need an introduction, so I say just a few words. Ian is Professor Emeritus of Film and Media History at Birkbeck, University of London. He has written several books, among them on the works of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, and on Martin Scorsese. Ian has published widely on cinema history and on early cinema in particular, and hence we are extremely pleased to have Ian here as our respondent. Hello, Ian. And the floor is yours.
Hello. I have just rushed in from a journey back from university. Some of you may have seen my message earlier to say that I was having difficulty connecting. Somebody has upgraded my college computer. So the sound isn't working. Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. So I'm afraid I've not been able to follow the course of the panel, but I have, of course, been able to read the papers along the way. And I suppose, I mean, this is obviously a fantastic project coming to a wonderful level of completion with the quantity of data that you're adding to it. And I was very interested in the observations that Martin and Yvonne make about the different quality of information from newspaper sources that's available in from different countries. This is very striking. I remember coming across the pattern of German advertising many years ago, when I was astonished to discover that German cinemas were advertising titles, actual film titles, from a very early stage, which is definitely not the case in Britain, as you observe. In fact, detailed advertising, including titles of films, is really a very late development in Britain, very late indeed. Whereas, of course, all of us working on early cinema, as you have observed, really benefit enormously from the tremendous work that's been done in Australia and New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand is an absolute paradise for wonderful information, very detailed, and has allowed many of us, I've used it certainly in my work on Robert Paul, to really round out a very detailed and really quite global picture of where even very early films got shown and distributed. So what we learn from this is not just about the importation of Asta Nielsen, which of course is the primary reason, but what we learn also is that we learn a lot of information about the different pattern that the parallel media of newspapers, etc., follow in different countries. And I suppose it's worth reflecting on this. What are the unintended benefits, consequences of a project on this scale? We're not just learning about progress of Asta Nielsen's career reflected in so many countries around the world. We're also learning about the parallel developments in related media. That's, I think, really interesting and really important. And we should reflect on that, because it isn't just about cinema. As most of us in early cinema have been saying for a very long time, cinema cannot be considered alone. It has to be considered as part of the envelope of other media, some of them pre-existing, how they're affected by the arrival of cinema. That's one point. The other point I want to make really is a more general reflection about, and I suppose it relates to the where do we go now question. I've just come from college, from Birkbeck College, from a session that I was chairing earlier today, which was about a very new phenomenon, which is the work of contemporary filmmakers, not only making feature films, but also making art gallery installations. We were presenting a session on Apichatpong, the Thai filmmaker, who is as active in his art gallery work as he is in his making of feature films like Memoria and Uncle Boonmee. So the students were grappling with this question of how do they spread their attention beyond the confines of film, very recent film, film that's had a global impact and recognition, but how do we actually look sideways and think about what impact this is having on the art world, on galleries and on museums? So actually, it's kind of the same issue in a way as the one I'm recommending in the light of the work on documenting the very early spread of Asta Nielsen's films. But I think the real question for me, as someone who is engaged in supervising masters and to some extent doctoral students, is how can we incentivize the researchers of today and tomorrow to really make use of this fantastic quantity of empirical and comparative information. It's really no good getting to this point of having such wonderful data if we can't incentivize the researchers of tomorrow to use it, and to use it in interesting, innovative, even creative ways. How can we pose a new set of questions which can now be framed and answered thanks to this wealth of new data? I suppose that would really be my main concern. I wouldn't want this to sit, this wonderful importing Asta Nielsen database, to just sit there admired. Of course, it deserves admiration, but it deserves much more than admiration. It deserves use. And we really have to think of ways, and I think it behoves people like ourselves, older people even, to come up with ideas about how it can be used. How can we expand the sphere of research, and how can we inspire people to take it up and to make use of these new digital repositories and collections? Those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ian. So we just launched the discussion then on the Q&A. So I open the floor to everyone in case there are any questions. Yes, please.
Can we talk about how
Thank you. I will just quickly repeat the question for Ian and Martin. So the question was about the database and the importing Asta Nielsen database and how we built the platform. What were the thoughts about that, and also maybe the infrastructure? And then a second question about the data itself, like how to identify newspapers, like because there are so many, for example, that are called the Times, so how could we identify them? So maybe if that is okay, I start with the first question, and Martin and Friederike, you can add to them. So the database started in Trier, at the University of Trier, initiated by Martin, and Martin paid a person who kind of put up the database. It's an SQL database, it's a relational database. That had been really a work in progress when we had the Asta Nielsen project. It's funded by the German Research Foundation. Unfortunately, they cut the money for the database, the development of the database, which caused a huge problem, which actually still is a problem. So we tried to hire people with other money to work on that, and now the database has moved to Marburg University and is hosted there, but it's kind of still, if I may say so, a struggle to get resources to work on the database. And we hope that also with this new digital cinema hub project that we can work a little bit more and experiment, and as Ian also suggested, to try new things with the data that is installed. So I think that's actually an issue, kind of the how do you make this such resources persistent? That's at the long term. maintenance is of course a question that is unresolved, and the university, they said they would take care of that, but they will take care of the data, but not exactly of the database, which is a huge difference, of course. But for now, we are still good. Yeah.
To answer the question concerning the history of the database, which now is nearly 9 years, it first was the idea was to accompany the proceedings of the conference importing Asta Nielsen, which I conducted in 1911 in Frankfurt Film Museum. Julie Ellen was one of the speakers, and after 9 years, this this thing is something not closing, but comes to a very important step, because first the readers of the book Importing Asta Nielsen should have the same information on sources as the authors had. And this was only possible to build up a small database. And then this model was so attractive that I decided to build up a collection of advertisements from different countries, just to give an overview of the variety of advertising Asta Nielsen in different film markets around the world. And just to give some glimpses. And now with the project with Yvonne, funded by the German Research Foundation, we could cover 4 countries in a wider range. That means we could finance the work of collecting the data from microfilm and newspapers in Germany, and from the websites in Austria and Britain and Australia and New Zealand. And so with meanwhile, for these countries, the website has become a research tool, because you can really do you can ask very questions and also answer many questions with the huge amount of adverts which we have. And we have not only the film titles, so you can check the running times or the duration, also the succession of different films in one town, and all this. But you can also open the context to the contemporary culture and proceedings, as we decided to collect in the metadata also all the persons which are named in the advertisements for Asta Nielsen films, dead or alive. So we have also Cleopatra. And Cleopatra is a competitor to Asta Nielsen, though she is already 2,000 years dead. But there are many Cleopatra films, and Cleopatra is very similar to Asta Nielsen. And sometimes you have a double feature, Cleopatra and Asta Nielsen. So this gives some also some inspiration to become creative in understanding film programming of that times.
Friederike, would you like to say something about the identification of newspapers, sources?
Yeah, about this problem to find persistent identifiers, or how we can generate one. And the problem is that the data sets are not fixed, because we are still working on it, enriching it with metadata. And when you have a persistent identifier, then it's persistent, and that is what we cannot guarantee, because we are still, it's a work on progress. And yeah, we are struggling with getting an DOI and DOI for our database, but it's I don't know, it's still a problem because of this yeah, additional work or reductional work we are still in. But yeah, hopefully we have a suggested citation on the website how we want to be cited, and yeah, but we are still working on to be in line with the FAIR principles. This is what we are looking forward.
Yes, please.
I really want to encourage you to just publish the data as is in a trusted repository, because you can always upload another version of the data with the same DOI. So I think, you know, you don't have to have the final set. Of course, you have to be happy with what is there now, but that is really important, I think. And I mentioned in our panel the new trend of data journals, like the Brill Research Data Journal for Humanities and Social Sciences, or the Journal of Open Humanities Data. Okay. And what's nice about those is that you can actually publish a paper that explains the origin of the data, the structure of the data set, and then you link this to your deposited data. That's a condition for publishing in such a journal. But it's a wonderful way to share data in a fair way, and also to claim authorship of the data and to be able to tell users how it came about. So that would be my suggestion.
Yes.
And we can talk later about how to keep it, how to make it somewhere in a university library as a living data set, because we have that in Amsterdam cinema context. But I know the problems there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julia. It's also that Media Rep intends to become also a data repository, not just like a repository of published articles from the media studies, but also really like a repository for research data with different levels of access, open access, which I find is very good. And we talk about that, and we also have already talked about data paper. And I think it's also that Nexus, that next journal, Nexus, they will also open a section for data paper. So I think that will be also a very good place to publish such papers. And yeah, thank you. Yes, please. Oh, yes, yes. So it's a suggestion or a question first, but also a suggestion to, at least for a small sample, to do geo-referencing. Because we have the places for the cinemas, and of course that would be great to map like cinema culture. Yeah, I think that is a very good idea, and that will, it's on the list. Thank you.
Okay, so you invited us to join the data sets live, and join with data set on also. So places where show us the data set. I have the data for 1919.
Okay, well, that sounds wonderful. So we just have to talk afterwards in detail. Mm-hmm.
And I have a question.
Okay, well, just repeat the question. So the first one was it was not a question, but an offer. What is your name, actually? Okay. Karina suggested or offered that she would give us her data on Warsaw and Asta Nielsen film exhibitions from the year of 1913. So we will talk afterwards. And then 2 questions for Friederike on Austria-Hungary and how does the research go there because of the different questions. Different languages, and also in regard to exhibition, whether she knows something about with which intertitles, what languages intertitles were accompanied with.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. The first, how do I deal with the different languages inside of Austria-Hungary? I think first we just made research on the German newspapers because they were so easily accessible, and we were just really blind about thinking that this is a multinational state, to be honest. And then we saw that there are so many newspapers in different languages. Yes, and but most of them are Hungarian, because yeah, it was the second empire of Austria-Hungary. And yeah, but fortunately they have OCR, and so we just copy them and make copy paste with the Steeple website. I don't know if you know it, but I'm really used to it now, just to yeah. And so I do this with the Hungarian speaking and with the Croatian speaking and Polish speaking, Czech, and all the languages. And yeah, most of them have OCR that I just can that copy it, and yeah, and then it's like yeah, some detective work, just wait what translating machine yeah puts out its output, and then I'm surprised what's the meaning of this cryptographic yeah, advertisement. Yeah, this is how I deal with it. I maybe one day I learn Hungarian and the other languages, but yeah, step by step. And this is also the big challenge when evaluating the Hungarian trade press, because this I only have in images, and I really have to tip it yeah, because there's no OCR possibility. Yeah, it's a bit of work, but maybe when you have some money, then maybe some students could make this tipping work. Yes. Yeah, but this is all has yeah, this is all has only ANO has only the newspapers from the Austrian Empire, not from Hungarian. No. Yeah, Austria had many Kronlands, 13, and they were also in other languages than in German, and but it's still yeah, belonging to the Austrian Empire. Yeah. And the second question is also a very interesting one about the intertitles when exhibiting German Asta Nielsen films. And this is also a question that I thought about. If in Hungary the films were translated or with new intertitles. Well, what I found out is that in Prague, which is in Bohemia, which is in Austria, that there the films were screened with I don't know, there was a second projector which screened the Czech intertitles, and this was in 1912. So the film was in German with German intertitles, and then they had a second kinematograph, a second projector, and or maybe they had and they put some slides, or they had just the intertitles and slides, and then they only showed the slides. This is an I just have one hit that was practice. Is it understandable how I mean? Yeah, and but unfortunately, I do not know how it was in Hungary. I just know that from 1912, 1913 on, there was a regulation from government, a governmental regulation that all films have to be in Hungarian with Hungarian intertitles. And this was a really big problem for the film distributors, that they have to change the copies, or have to do it like in Prague, because of this I know it, where they have the second slides with a screen parallel with the film.
I think you were first. You had a question? No?
Yeah, I was saying if you put it on the screen, the table, the CSV table was
Could you please speak up again?
yeah, just that if you do put it in a repository, if you save each table as a CSV file with just a documentary explanation of the relationships in the table, you can also save it as a SQL export, but it will be much easier. The skill level to open a CSV is, most of us have it, and the skill level to like import a SQL create table document into a SQL database is much more advanced.
Okay, thank you. So I think we should also talk afterwards again. So just to quickly explain, it's about how to kind of put the database into a repository, and it's a CSV file, the format that is very useful also to save tables. But there are different levels of professionality, we could say, and I think we can talk afterwards about that. Okay, so there's I think one final question. Okay, thank you very much. As this is just a call not only to speak about paradise, but also about hell, and for example, where about areas like the Balkans where there's hardly any evidence so far. And I think it's an important point because we do have a Western perspective on Asta Nielsen so far, so we just know a little bit, and it's the usual approach. So yes, we should enlarge on that. And so the question is whether we do research on Bosnia, for example, and you also offered to share your research on, for example, a distributor from Smyrna who traveled a lot to Sofia to get Asta Nielsen prints and so on. So it's another great offer. Thank you very much. But I think you can answer the question best.
Yes, the question was, how do I deal, or do I deal with Bosnia? And the answer is yes, I do. Every information I can get, or every cinema ad I can get about Asta Nielsen on Asta Nielsen is interesting for me in this area. And I browse through different databases. Or archives which are digitized. So I have my different tables for Hungarian, Czech, Polish, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia. I think it's all databases or newspaper archives that are digitized, and from time to time, maybe I check if there are new hits on Asta Nielsen, and if there would be some on Asta Nielsen, or if I would find a database to Bosnian archives. I'm from my mind, I have no. I'm not sure that I have had access to a Bosnian newspaper archive. But if you know one, then tell me, and I will start research immediately. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I can share my list with databases or newspaper archives on the Balkans, yeah, which are from the Habsburg Empire, as I know so far.
Okay, so I think we have come to an end. So thank you very much for your questions and also for all the presentations. And we end this panel as promised with the launch of the 7th edition of the Importing Asta Nielsen database that I herewith declare. Applause to Martin especially, and to Friederike and all people who have contributed to it so far. And so we invite you all to celebrate the launch with us. We move to the Passus bar just across the street, and there will be Prosecco and some small things to eat. So please join us. And thanks again, Ian, and thanks, Martin. We'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.